Um, and the Ukraine has relied too much on help from the West. Again, this is an astonishing, incredibly dishonest statement, because the only reason Ukraine went to war with Russia at all, the only reason Ukraine maneuvered towards, pressed to join NATO, the only reason Ukraine failed to implement the Minsk agreement, the only reason Ukraine walked away from the Istanbul agreement, is because the West urged it to, or the West encouraged it to. At the time when Ukraine first applied to join NATO, made an application to join NATO at the Bucharest summit in 2008, the big majority of Ukrainians opposed NATO entry. But they were encouraged to pursue it. They were told to make it, to enshrine it in their constitution. There was endless agitation and pressure from Western leaders to do that. When the Minsk agreement was signed, after the Maidan events, which of course the West also supported, when the Minsk agreement was signed, the Ukrainians said they decided that they weren't going to implement it, and they were encouraged not to implement it by the Western powers, by the Americans and the British overtly, as we now know, by the Germans and the French covertly. And of course, the worst of all, after the Istanbul Agreement was agreed in April 2022, the Western powers told Ukraine to walk away. They were told, and this is hardly controversial, that if the Istanbul Agreement was signed, if Ukraine went ahead with it, the United States and Britain would refuse to extend to Ukraine security guarantees. And at the same time, they were told that they could continue the war with the Russians and they would get all the help, all the assistance they needed, all the weapons that they needed. The Russians were weak, much weaker than anybody had expected, and they would be provided with all the weapons that were needed, and, well, that would be enough to stop the Russians and to push them back and to engineer the regime, provoke the regime change in Moscow. And of course, the sanctions were also expected to succeed. And if we go back to 2022, after the Kharkiv offensive, the only really successful offensive that Ukraine has ever launched over the course of this war, and a massively costly offensive in terms of men and material. It was as well, by the way. But anyway, after the Kharkiv offensive, it was the West again that pressed Ukraine to launch its utterly disastrous summer 2023 offensive that supplied them with all those Abrams tanks and Leopard 2 tanks and Challenger 2 tanks, which we're now told were not a silver bullet, with the Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, the only armoured vehicle apparently that the Ukrainians rate at all amongst the many armoured vehicles that the West has supplied them. Anyway, it was the West again that basically urged the Ukrainians to launch this offensive that ended catastrophically for them. And after the failure of the 2023 offensive, according to the Ukrainian media, and no one in Britain is denying this, the British urged the Ukrainians to go back on the attack again and urged them to launch the operation in Krinky, to conduct an amphibious operation across the Dnieper, this in the autumn, as the weather conditions were getting worse. And we now have told by the Ukrainians that the intended purpose of this operation was not just to establish some tiny bridgehead in some isolated village on the east bank of the Dnieper, but to press forward and to conduct a kind of replay of Normandy and to advance all the way to Crimea itself. Anyway, we're now told that it's the Ukrainians' fault, that they haven't actually mobilized enough troops, that they've relied too much on Western weapons that weren't a silver bullet. I have to say, if I was a Ukrainian reading this, I would choke. I would find this one of the most infuriating things. Now, I'm not somebody who feels any sympathy whatsoever with Zelensky and his officials. I did once, by the way, when he was elected. I thought his election was a good thing, and I liked all the things he was saying at that time. For a very long time, I felt sorry for him. But over time, speaking entirely for myself, all that has, well, it's long since evaporated away. But reading a comment like this, it almost makes me feel sorry for him again. Going back to that famous phrase of Professor Mearsheimer's about how Ukraine was led along the primrose path to its own destruction. Well, here we see the very people who led it along that primrose path, people of the Biden administration, the neocons, all of those people, and they're telling us, well, we did what we could, we gave Ukraine all the weapons, but ultimately it was their fault because they didn't do enough to bolster their own war effort, especially by mobilizing enough soldiers.